Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, FinCyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at FS-ISAC. Here at our EMEA Summit in Brussels, Europe's Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, is top of mind. But what does it mean to truly be operationally resilient in any crisis? I spoke with Fadwa Rachi, Director of Mastercard's European Cyber Resilience Center, about building the structures, processes, and most of all, the culture to truly weather any storm. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to speak with you. So we are talking about operational resilience, and we're living in a world where basically it's so complex and interconnected, and anything could go wrong at any one time. How do you define operational resilience, especially for a company as large and ubiquitous in the global economy as Mastercard?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for having me as well. I think defining operational resilience is really important, but I do feel like there's a lot of definitions out there. And so it's really important for your organization to be able to determine what that means for you and that to be understood in your organization. So I want to start with that as first sort of message. I think for us, the way we define operational resilience is really the ability to absorb shocks, to go through some of the waves, to be able to recover from that, but also being able to continue to deliver minimum services, right? It's not just about the recovery, it's how you go through the motion. And I think with, the volatility that we see from a political point of view, equally climate volatility and many other changes in the operating field, it's really important for organizations to be able to adapt, I think, to these kind of changes. And sometimes these changes can be very rapid. So it's about having that flexibility in your approach when it comes to resilience as a whole, I want to say, because what it really means to be resilient is to be able to go through the motions, I was saying, learn from what you've gone through. And I think we'd be naive to think that, we'd be excluded from these kind of changes. Every organization will go through it. So it's how you deal with it and how you come back on the other end of that situation.
How would you advise firms to go about thinking about from, you said, define what it means for your organization. So how should they do that? And then how should they then take it through and start socializing it so that they can ensure that everybody's on the same page?
I think, first of all, the tone is set at the top, as with many things. And so your top management needs to understand what that means for your organization, agree on what operational resilience means for your organization, and then communicate that clearly to staff. People really need to understand what it is, not just repeat it. I want to say, how do you go about defining it? It's really, I think, questioning, okay, if, we were hugely impacted, what are the minimal critical services we need to continue to deliver, if you're critical infrastructure or not, to be able to, at least service your customers and provide them the bare minimum of what you do, whatever that service may be or that product really may be. So what is it you really need to continue to do? And at a minimum, it doesn't mean you don't continue to do all those other things that are equally important, but that should be your main focus, protecting those, I want to say, core assets almost, your crown jewels of your organization during an incident, during a crisis, during whatever you're going through. And that's how I would sort of start defining. And I think that's also how regulators look at it. Are you continuing to deliver the minimum for your organization, for your customers?
You've defined operational resilience and you've communicated it to everybody. How do you start planning for incidents that could happen, especially when you don't know exactly where it's going to come from, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. I think you should get ready for not everything, because that's possible, but for anything. And the way we've approached that is having what we call an all hazards approach. It's flexible. It's a framework that we can really adapt to respond to an incident, to a crisis, regardless of the source, really, of that situation. And I think that helps us to respond, consistently and in a coordinated manner. Everybody understands what their roles are within that structure. I think training is equally really, really important in that, so people build that muscle memory. I think also having the right sort of responders in your team is really important. And what I mean by that is, one, they understand what your overall response strategy is. They don't need to know your plan, letter by letter or anything of that sort. But they need to be able to understand the gist of it and then adapt it where it is required. And I think lastly, they need to have the authority to make certain key decisions as well, because, time is really important during your response. And so they need to have that gravitas and authority to be able to do that. Really.
Can we talk a little bit more about what all hazards, like at what level is that playbook pitched? Because FS-ISAC runs the all hazards playbook for the entire financial sector. So we have leveraged it in many different contexts. But I think at a firm level, it's important to kind of define what it is and what it isn't, right? It's not prescribing, as you said, it's not prescribing a response for every little thing that could go wrong. And so how do you strike the right balance of structure and detail to have that flexibility to be able to respond to anything?
Yeah. I want to say we do have those detailed plans, right, for certain scenarios that we deem important, that are, a risk to the organization. We do have that, but we also know that in the heat of a moment, when an incident happens, when a crisis occurs, people don't necessarily have the time to start going into. So they should train that, exercise that up front, so they have a high level understanding of that. But the all hazards approach means that, regardless of the incident, is it caused a human caused error? Is it a technology error or any other sorts? We have that high level structure of intake, triage, response, recovery, lessons learned, and how do we go about that? When do you stand down your crisis, right? Which is really, really important. And sort of when you have those key decisions, and who makes those key decisions, and who should we be involving from the different response teams that we have, because we have different levels of response, the tactical level, the strategic level, the operational level as well. And we've sort of divide them into buckets. You have your office response teams that are really your local teams that have the local insights, that understand, the culture, and then have those partnerships locally. And then on top of that, we have the regional crisis response teams that are, providing additional resources, that are overseeing the response across the region if it's impacting multiple countries within that region, and it can help a little bit define the strategy. And then you have your corporate crisis response team that are responsible for the overall oversight, the strategic direction, especially on global incidents. And I also want to say if it's a local incident, we activate the ORT. If it goes up, we activate the RCERT is what we call it, so Regional Crisis Response Team. But it doesn't mean we stand down the ORTs, because they are ears and eyes on the ground. So I think having that structured response team with similar membership, right? And equally having that framework around intake, triage, et cetera, allows us to apply all hazards, framework, whilst also having some of those detailed plans where it is necessary. We think it's likely.
Right. The more sort of critical scenarios, right, have more detail, but then you have this sort of larger, more flexible response, because you may not know things will go, just because it hasn't happened before, it doesn't mean it won't happen in the future.
Think about the pandemic. Exactly. And it just allows people to understand the different steps that we will go through and what to expect. And our responders have been trained, exercised for years on different scenarios, and they've learned to adapt it flexibly.
So let's talk about all the different types of functions that need to be involved, and then how the coordination happens. I mean, you talked a little bit about, so you've got 3 levels, essentially, the local, regional, and global. But then within that, sort of vertically, there's all these different functions that need to coordinate. Who is involved, and how do you coordinate them all together?
It's really important at the start of your incident or your crisis that you're facing, you understand the scope. And then we start by bringing in what we call the core team. We assess the situation, what's going on, what is the status. We do a round table. Everybody is able to provide their feedback. And then from there, we determine, okay, is this impacting staff, for example? We should bring in what we call P&C, people and capabilities, which is basically HR. We might bring others. So we're not activating the full team for every single incident, but we have a base core team where we know that they will always be required during a response, like legal, like comms, and like our crisis commanders, for example, as well. And usually our commanders have sort of a holistic view of our business, so they know who to bring in when, what part of the business, because it is very complex, the environment that we operate in.
Yeah.
Different products, different services, etc. So we really heavily rely on our commanders as well to be able to bring in the right people. That's sort of their responsibility as well.
How do you ensure that you have the mechanisms in place for all of these teams at the local, regional, and global level, but then also across the different functions to really effectively communicate quickly and with sort of minimal back and forth and minimal dilly-dallying, if you will?
So I think communication is really, really important in an incident, in a crisis situation. We have the framework. So as I said before, the comms team is always involved in any crisis or incident that we deal with, and they help us tremendously, be it, from an internal perspective, from an external perspective. I think what we do really well as we regularly share updates on the status of, what are we seeing? Even at the start of an incident, it's really important that you have a common operating picture that you're working with. We determine what the next actions are, and we share those with those that need to know about it. We also communicate with our staff internally so they know what's going on. And in a pre-crisis situation, I run our European Cyber Resilience Center. We're also communicating very proactively on a regular basis. So the ECRC really brings together about 30 plus teams from across the business, different disciplines, from your comms team, your legal teams, to the very technical teams, more vulnerability management, your SOC, etc. And we have weekly calls, we have daily chats, almost, I want to say, about what is going on. We've cultivated that culture of sharing information openly. Doing that in a structured manner is really important. So what I mean by that is you need to sometimes simplify information so you don't have information overload. You also need to prevent, I want to say, reoccurring activities, so multiple people doing the same thing, and that you can do that by communicating actively. And I think if you are dealing with an incident and you are gathering that information early on, it will help you to respond more effectively, more efficiently. So having this huge incentive structure in and of itself, I think by nature, helps you break down silos. But we really encourage teams by sitting them together in the center, by having these regular conversations, by sharing knowledge, sharing information that we see from the outside world, both internally in a secured manner, and all the members, are key members of the ECRC, but they also know that the information needs to stay within those four walls because those are the responders.
It sounds like, clearly you take a really proactive approach to crisis management, right? And there's more and more incidents, right? So I still see a lot of firms kind of getting caught off guard or being on the back foot sometimes, like they haven't, and even for all the talk, like people just never would have thought that this would happen. I don't know how to deal with it or whatever. So how would you suggest instilling that proactive culture that you guys clearly have, been really excelling at over the last several years?
So I'm going to bring it back to a previous point that I had. It really starts at the top layer of your organization. So the support that they provide and the importance that they give to crisis management. And I think oftentimes in organizations that hasn't been the case in the past, where they only think it's important when an incident happens or where a crisis happens, and then it's full steam ahead, all hands on deck. But you really got to prepare before the crisis happens. Do you have your right plans? You have a good response team? Are they trained? Are they exercised? Do they understand the different roles and responsibilities? Have they built that muscle memory to be able to adapt?
Yeah, to use that frame a lot as well. Yeah.
It is really, really important because it allows for flexibility. You understand, I was saying previously, the overall strategy, what do we do or do not do as an organization, but you adapt it flexibly. And I will say that, in our organization, we have top level support. I was saying earlier, if I pick up the phone, I know that certain, very senior stakeholders will pick up the phone to respond to that situation. So the attention that is given to that. I just think personally that, after COVID, we have seen, a better appreciation for incident response, for crisis management. So that definitely has helped move things along a little bit, because that was something that people thought would never happen at that scale, but it did, right? So I think we need to continue to push that message to say, expect the unexpected.
What would you say are the essential elements of an effective and flexible incident response plan? We touched on it a little bit, but let's go a little bit, sort of step by step on it.
One, clear roles and responsibilities. You don't want people to sort of fall over each other, start doing the same thing. Everybody needs to understand, as I said, your framework, your all hazards plan as part of the response team, and needs to understand their role within a crisis, within an incident. So we clearly also, during our calls, when we do have a crisis call, we will say, okay, this is the situation, and this is, led by the crisis team. These are the actions that need to be taken, and they are given clear owners. And just overall, we know who to provide those actions to, and people understand, where their role starts and where it ends. I think that one's really important. I think having a good understanding and having that common operating picture that we talked about at the start of an incident, and then during have those regular updates, because I think if you're working off of different facts, you might be working against each other, and you're not sort of all working towards a common goal. So have clear sort of incident classification, prioritization as well within your organization. So how do you define crisis? What is important? How much attention do you give to this incident versus another is also really important, because you cannot respond to every single thing with the same level of importance. So prioritization is also really important. And I would say in your containment and remediation, know at what point you sort of stand out. Super, super important, I think. And communicate that. Make it very clear to everybody on the response team and even within your organization that, this is no longer a crisis situation. We're moving to a BAU situation where we can use that. Equally, I'm going to say the last step, which was really important, lesson flying. So how do you go back and see how well did we respond in the first place as a response team, but also how does, whatever the incident might be, what we learned from that apply across the rest of the organization, right? Because especially in multinational organizations, I think this might occur in one small part of the organization. You need to make sure that you're applying that throughout the whole organization, because otherwise it'll just pop up in another end, right? Yeah. So we're really good at that, I think, about learning and thinking about the bigger picture of things and their larger impact.
So obviously one of the things that FS-ISAC does when we run our exercises, since we have such a large threat intelligence arm, we use the latest threat intelligence to inform the scenarios that we build for our exercises. How do you guys do that? And how would you suggest that firms look at threat intelligence to know that they're exercising something that's actually real and plausible could happen?
I think threat intelligence is really important here. It helps you, as you said, understand, have situational awareness of what's going on currently. So we use it, as we respond to incidents in a pre-crisis situation as well, continuously monitoring what's going on, what is out there, what are the potential threats. And I think then in your actual crisis or your actual exercise as part of it, it's really important as well, right? Are you exercising the right thing? What does the landscape look like for you as an organization? And I think you have your global risks, that every organization might face. You also should probably look at it on a regional level. So what is impacting me in this region? We are seeing certain phenomena in Europe that we're not seeing somewhere else. And so probably our European regional crisis response team will be asked to deal with the situation, whereas maybe our EMEA one might not. I'm just giving examples here. And so you want to make sure that they have built that muscle memory and that the others understand also what that means. So I think it's, to your point, actually, I just want to sort of second that. It's really important that you do take that as a part of your, building your exercise. The way you do that, that was your original question, I think is early on when you're defining, your exercise schedule, you're defining what type of exercise you will run and what scope it will cover. It's important that you have your conversations with your risk teams. They understand. You have your global risk teams, of course, that you can consult, but also your regional risk teams. But also, have those conversations with organizations like FS-ISAC. They also have a really good understanding of the risk landscape, and that can help shape. So don't just look internally, also look externally at risk assessments.
Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you think is important to mention that, for the sector, we would all benefit from knowing?
As I lead our ECRC, European Cyber Resilience Center, I think, and I've said this before, we need to come together as private sector, public sector, law enforcement, other regulatory agencies to really tackle cybercrime. These cyber criminals are working together and they're coming together. They're becoming more audacious. They are targeting bigger companies as well, and even the smaller ones, with using tactics such as AI. We're seeing also certain trends, rapid digitization, increased connectivity, et cetera, which are all good things, but they are also fueling cybercrime to become a real industry. I think we need to also unite to fight cybercrime. So I really sort of want to give that message. Let's come together. Security and unity is super critical when, I want to say, against what is a very challenging situation for all of us. And maybe on a cyber specific or on a crisis specific one, having been a crisis manager for a few years, I want to say two things. I said this before, and I want to emphasize it again. Know when to stand down your response. Know when things have become business as usual. This is now the new normal that we are operating in. And especially during those long-lasting crises such as the pandemic, you need to give people breathers from that crisis situation. Allow them a little bit of time to actually, take a bit of time off that response, put other people into that response that are equally qualified to do that. And sometimes you're going to have to force their hand a little bit because we are so into the subject. They really want to do good for the organization, for the greater good in general. And sometimes you'll find they don't want to, but it's really important for them to take a moment of rest as well, because you can't do that for a very prolonged time. It's a very intense, stressful situation. So we need to stay sharp, and that means you need to rest.